The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Margaret Calloway's mother told the dinner table that a woman like Margaret would be lucky to find a man willing to overlook her plainness. Margaret set the telegram on the kitchen counter and pretended she hadn't heard. She was good at that. 26 years of practice. The telegram was from a ranch in Alberta, 300 miles north of Calgary, from a man named Ethan Rourke, who had answered the notice her cousin Frances had placed in the Saskatchewan Farming Gazette without telling her. A notice that described Margaret as capable, hard-working, and of good Christian character, with no mention of her brown hair that went limp in the humidity, or the scar along her jaw from a childhood fall, or the fact that she was, as her mother so often reminded her, not the kind of woman men wrote poems about. Ethan Rourke had said yes. Margaret read the telegram 4 times standing at the kitchen counter, while her mother rattled on about the Hendersons' youngest daughter, who'd just gotten engaged to a lawyer from Winnipeg. She read it a 5th time after supper, alone in the narrow bedroom she'd shared with Frances, until Frances married and moved to Lethbridge. She read it until the words stopped being words and became something else entirely. A door, maybe, or a window. Something with a view she hadn't expected. She did not sleep that night. Frances admitted it at breakfast the next morning, over toast and weak tea, with a particular guilty brightness of someone who believes they've done a kindness. She'd seen the advertisement in the back pages, she said. A widower, 2 children, good land north of Olds. She'd thought of Margaret immediately. No harm in writing, she'd said, just to see. Their mother's face went the color of old milk. Margaret said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the telegram folded in her apron pocket. She looked at her mother's expression, which contained pity in the particular way a blade contains an edge, not obvious until it cuts. She looked at Frances, who was twisting her wedding ring the way she always did when she knew she'd overstepped. Then Margaret said quietly that she was going to write back. The uproar lasted 3 days. Her mother cried. Her father, who rarely weighed in on anything, said it was undignified. Frances alternated between defending herself and begging Margaret to at least wait until spring, as though weather might change her mind. The neighbors found out, because in a town of 1,200 people the neighbors always found out, and the whispers at the Saturday market were not kind. Poor Margaret Calloway, they said, so desperate she'd answer a stranger's advertisement, so plain she had to go looking in the farming papers. Margaret packed her trunk on the 4th day. She owned very little that was worth taking. 3 plain dresses, a wool coat that had been let out twice at the seams, a Bible her grandmother had given her, a copy of Anne of Green Gables with a cracked spine from reading it too many times. She left the cameo brooch her mother had always said would go to Frances because it suited Frances better. She left the yellow curtains she'd embroidered for a hope chest she'd quietly stopped believing in. She left the girl who'd spent 26 years being the afterthought in her own family. The morning she left, her father shook her hand. Her mother kissed her cheek with dry lips and said to write when she arrived, as though Alberta were another country, and not a day's train ride north. Frances hugged her at the door and whispered, "I'm sorry, Maggie. I only wanted something good for you." "I know," Margaret said, and strangely she did. The train north was full of settlers and their noise, children running the aisles, men with loud opinions about the wheat crop, women talking over each other in the dining car. Margaret sat alone by the window and watched Saskatchewan flatten into Alberta, and thought about what she knew of Ethan Rourke, which was almost nothing. The telegram had been spare. Widower 34. 2 children, a girl of 9 and a boy of 6. Ranch outside a town called Crossfield, north of Calgary. The work would be hard and the winters would be harder. He did not promise romance. He did not promise anything except honesty, and Margaret had decided that honesty from a stranger was worth more than poetry from a man who didn't mean it. An older woman across the aisle caught her eye and asked where she was headed. To be married, Margaret told her. The woman raised her eyebrows. To someone you know? To someone I intend to know. The woman laughed, not unkindly, and said she'd done the same thing 30 years ago, and it had turned out all right most of the time. Most of the time was enough to make Margaret feel fractionally better. The station at Crossfield was a single platform and a wooden building with peeling paint. Margaret stepped off the train into October air that bit right through her wool coat and understood immediately that Alberta was a different kind of cold than she was used to. Not the damp cold of home, something drier, more honest. It didn't pretend to be anything but what it was. She saw him before she recognized him. He stood apart from the handful of people on the platform, arms crossed, hat pulled against the wind. Tall, angular, with the kind of face that had been outdoors too long, weathered without being old, watchful without being unkind. He was looking at the train with an expression she couldn't read, and then he was looking at her, and something in the directness of it made her chin come up on instinct. She crossed the platform to him. "Margaret Calloway," she said. "Ethan Rourke." He touched the brim of his hat. "The wagon's this way." That was the entirety of the greeting. He loaded her trunk without asking if she needed help, and without making a production of doing it. He offered her a hand up to the wagon seat, with the practicality of a man helping with a gate latch. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they rolled away from the platform into a landscape so wide it seemed to breathe. Margaret sat beside him and said nothing, because there seemed to be nothing required yet. After a mile of silence, he said, "You're quieter than I expected. I didn't realize you'd formed an expectation." The corner of his mouth moved. "Not quite a smile," he said. "Your cousin's letter was enthusiastic. Francis is enthusiastic about most things." He nodded, watching the road. Then he said, "My first wife was enthusiastic. She arrived thinking it would be like the stories." He paused. It wasn't. Margaret looked at the sky, which was enormous and going gray at the edges. What happened to her? Pneumonia. 3 winters ago. He said it without inflection. The way people say things they've said too many times for the grief to stay sharp. She wasn't built for this country. "I'm sorry. You didn't know her." "No, but you did." He glanced at her then, just briefly. Then he turned back to the road, and didn't speak again until the ranch appeared over a low rise. A collection of buildings that looked solid and well used. A farmhouse with smoke coming from 2 chimneys. Outbuildings arranged with the logic of someone who thought carefully about work. "It's not beautiful," he said, "but it holds." Margaret looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected. Not the sinking of a woman confronting a mistake, but the particular steadiness of a person recognizing something that might, with time, become theirs. "It looks like it means it," she said. Ethan looked at her again, longer this time. 2 small figures burst from the farmhouse before they'd finished pulling up. The girl reached the wagon first, 9 years old and serious-faced, with her father's watchful eyes and a braid that had mostly come undone. The boy was right behind her, smaller and louder, with a gap where his 2 front teeth should have been. The girl stopped at the wagon wheel and looked at Margaret with the frank assessment of a child who has learned not to trust too quickly. "Are you the woman from the advertisement?" she asked. "I am. My name is Margaret." "I'm Clara Rourke." The girl said it like a declaration of terms. "This is my brother Owen." Owen, who was 6 and apparently not interested in formality, pointed at Margaret's jaw and said, "What happened there?" "Owen," Ethan's voice was a quiet warning. "It's all right," Margaret said. She touched the scar without thinking about it, the old reflex of covering it, overridden by something steadier. "I fell off a fence when I was about your age," she told Owen, trying to prove I could balance on the top rail. Owen's eyes went wide. "Did it bleed a lot?" "Enormously." He looked deeply impressed. Clara remained skeptical, which Margaret found more trustworthy. The house was large by prairie standards, clean the way a house gets when a man does his best but doesn't quite know where the softness goes. No curtains on the front windows, rugs worn to their backing, a kitchen that functioned without quite living. Margaret moved through the rooms that first afternoon with Clara trailing behind her, not touching anything, not offering opinions, just absorbing. She found the room at the end of the upstairs hall with a closed door. Clara stopped in front of it and said, "That was Mum's sewing room. We don't go in there." "All right," Margaret said. Clara looked at her, measuring. "You didn't ask why." "Should I have?" "And most people ask why." Margaret considered that. "When you want to tell me, you will," she said. "Until then, it's your door to keep." Something shifted in the girl's expression. Not warmth yet, but the beginning of a question mark where there had only been a wall. The first test came before the first week was out. Margaret was in the kitchen learning the peculiarities of the wood stove, which ran hot on the left side and sullen on the right, when she heard voices rising in the yard. She looked out the window and saw 2 ranch hands facing off near the water trough, both of them past the point of words being enough. She dried her hands on her apron and walked outside. The men were so deep into it they didn't notice her until she was 6 feet away and said, "Clearly, that's enough." They both turned. One of them, a broad man named Dunnett, who she'd been introduced to the day before, started to say something dismissive. She looked at him without flinching and said, "I'm not asking." Dunnett closed his mouth. The other man, younger, embarrassed now, looked at his boots. Whatever this is about, Margaret said, it doesn't get resolved this way. Not on this property. Are we agreed? A long, ugly pause. Then Dunnett said, yes, ma'am, with an edge on it, but still. She went back inside and stood at the kitchen counter, with her hands braced against it until they stopped shaking. Then she finished making the bread. That night, Ethan came in late from checking the fence line, ate the supper she'd kept warm, and said, without looking up from his plate, Dunnett told me what happened. Margaret said nothing. He said, you didn't have to do that. Someone did. He ate in silence for a moment. Then he said, most women would have come to get me. You weren't here. He looked at her across the table. The lamplight made his face harder to read. He said, I'm beginning to think your cousin undersold you. Francis undersells everything that isn't Francis, Margaret said, and he laughed. A short, surprised sound, like something that had gotten out before he'd decided to let it. That was the first time she heard him laugh. The town of Crossfield had opinions about everything, and it had particular opinions about Ethan Rourke's new arrangement. Margaret heard them at the general store 2 weeks after she arrived, in the particular way small towns have, of saying things loudly enough to be overheard. The women clustered near the dry goods were civil in the way of people who have decided you are a curiosity. One of them, a Mrs. Hartfield, welcomed her to the community with a smile that did not reach her eyes and asked whether she found the adjustment difficult, coming from so far south. The word practical was used twice in 3 sentences, both times like a stone wrapped in cotton. Margaret smiled and agreed that practicality was an underrated quality. On her way out, she passed a woman coming in, perhaps 50, with gray braided hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had nothing to prove to anybody. The woman held the door for her and said, Don't let Vera Hartfield get under your skin. She's been trying to run this town for 20 years, and she's only managed about half of it. Margaret smiled. I appreciate the assessment. Ruth Beaulieu. She offered her hand. I run the lending library such as it is. If you need books, come find me. If you need a friend, come find me sooner. That was the beginning of the only real friendship Margaret would make in Crossfield that winter, which turned out to be enough. October became November, and the cold came down from the north, like something with intent. Margaret learned the rhythms of the ranch the way you learn a language you're living inside of. Not by study, but by necessity, by mistake, by the patient instruction of people who'd known these things all their lives. Dunnett remained prickly, but not hostile. The other hands, 2 brothers named Price, who spoke mostly to each other and occasionally to their horses, acknowledged her with nods that gradually acquired warmth. Clara remained watchful. Owen followed Margaret everywhere and asked questions at a rate that she found genuinely enjoyable, because the questions were real ones, not performance, just pure curiosity delivered without any sense that it might be inconvenient. Ethan was harder to read. He was not cold, but he held himself at a remove that was less about unfriendliness than about long practice. He'd learned to function at a distance from people, and functioning was what he knew how to do. He asked her opinion on household matters with the gravity of a man who understood that the asking was important. He told her the truth when she asked him questions, even the uncomfortable ones. He did not talk about his wife unless she was mentioned by someone else, and then only briefly, and then the shutters came down. One night in November, with the first real snow coming against the windows, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, doing the household accounts because Ethan had admitted, without great embarrassment, that numbers were not his strong suit. He sat across from her reading something, or pretending to, and after a while he set the book down and said, Why did you come? She looked up. I told you. Francis placed the notice and I decided to answer it. No. He leaned forward slightly. Your cousin placed the notice. You could have ignored it. Could have written back and said there'd been a mistake. Why didn't you? Margaret set down her pencil. She looked at the accounts and then at his face, which was serious in the way it always was, serious without being severe. Because in the town I came from, she said, I was the plain Calloway girl, the one who didn't draw the eye. My mother loved me in the way that people love things they're slightly ashamed of, quietly, and with apologies. She paused. I wasn't unhappy, exactly, but I was invisible, and I thought that if I stayed, I would die invisible. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My wife felt invisible here. That's different, I know. But I want you to understand that I know what it costs a person, that kind of loneliness. I don't want that for you. It's different, Margaret said. You're right. She felt invisible by confinement. I felt invisible by being overlooked. She gestured at the window, the snow, the enormous dark beyond it. This doesn't overlook me. It requires me. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You're not invisible here. You should know that." She looked back at her accounts because she didn't trust her face. The trouble began in December, arriving on horseback in the person of a man named Gerald Price, who owned a significant portion of the land south and east of the Rourke property, and had been attempting to acquire the Rourke water access for 3 years by methods that ranged from legal to borderline. He arrived at the door while Ethan was out and introduced himself to Margaret with a wide smile and expensive boots. He expressed his sympathy about her situation, the word situation again, like a diagnosis, and suggested that a woman of her evident intelligence must find the isolation difficult. He mentioned that the Rourke land, while productive, carried significant debt from the previous 2 seasons, and that certain financial pressures might make a sale, if not now then soon, a reasonable consideration. He said all of this with the warmth of a man who believed he was helping. Margaret offered him coffee, listened to all of it, and said, when he was finished, "Thank you for stopping by. I'll let Ethan know you called." Price's smile thinned at the edges. "Of course, but if you were to speak with him, woman to man, as they say, about the practical realities." "I speak with my husband as one adult to another," Margaret said pleasantly, "and I'll give him your message exactly as you delivered it." She opened the door. He left. She closed the door and stood in the hallway with her back against it, listening to the sound of her own breathing settle. When Ethan came in that evening, she told him everything, word for word, the way she'd heard it. His face went through several things in quick succession. She watched him arrive at cold. "He's been circling this land for years," he said. "What does he actually want?" "The creek that runs through the north pasture. It's the only year-round water source for 4 properties in a dry year. Whoever controls it controls a lot of leverage." "What's the actual risk?" Ethan set down his hat. "The bank loan comes due in February. I had a bad year with the herd. Lost 11 head to the cold last winter. If I can't make the payment, the bank will call the note and Price will be waiting." Margaret sat down at the table. She said, "Tell me the numbers." He told her. She wrote them down. She spent the next hour with a pencil and the household ledger, while Ethan sat across from her and answered her questions, which were specific and methodical, and occasionally surprised him into a different kind of silence than the one she was used to from him. "What about the timber on the east quarter?" she asked. "Scrub pine mostly, not worth harvesting." "What about the grazing lease on the upper section? You're not running cattle there this season." "No, the fence needs repair and I haven't had the hands to spare." "Could you lease it? To a neighboring operation that needs winter range?" He stared at her. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Possibly. Henderson runs short on range in a heavy snow year. He's mentioned it." "Have you mentioned it to him?" "No." Margaret wrote that down. She said, "What else is there that has value you're not using?" That was the beginning of 3 weeks of nights at the kitchen table, building a case for the bank and a plan for the season. While the snow came down and the children slept upstairs, and something shifted in the air between them that neither of them remarked on directly. Ethan went to Henderson. Henderson was interested in the grazing lease. The income wouldn't cover the full loan, but combined with the deferral Margaret helped Ethan petition the bank for, a petition he had not known he could make, because he had never thought to ask. It would cover enough. Price tried again in January, this time through the bank itself, acquiring a minor interest in the debt and making his intentions clear. Margaret found this out through Ruth Beaulieu, who knew the bank manager's wife, and told Ethan the same afternoon. He went quiet, in the way she was coming to understand meant he was genuinely frightened beneath the surface. He said, "If he gets control of that note." "He won't," Margaret said. "You don't know that." "No, but I know we're not finished finding options." She looked at him. "Are you the kind of man who gives up when things are hard?" The look he gave her was complicated. "No." "Then trust me to think alongside you. Stop trying to protect me from the problem and let me help solve it." A long silence. Then he said quietly, "Charlotte, my wife, she didn't want to know about the difficulties. She felt it was too much." "I'm not Charlotte." "I know," he said. "I'm beginning to know that very well." The solution came from Clara, of all places. Clara, who had been listening at the edge of rooms for 2 months, absorbing everything with her father's watchful eyes, came to Margaret one afternoon with a drawing. It was a map, child-drawn but surprisingly accurate, of the property lines and the creek and the adjacent parcels. "There's water on the Gothy land, too," Clara said, pointing. Old Mr. Gothy showed me where it comes up, before he got sick. He said his grandfather dug it. Margaret looked at the map, then she looked at Clara. Then she said, Clara, can you show me where exactly? The Gauthier spring, it turned out, had been quietly flowing from a source that predated the disputed water rights by 40 years. It didn't cross into Price's jurisdiction. It had simply been forgotten because old Mr. Gauthier had been ill for 3 seasons, and his land was managed by a nephew who lived in Edmonton and paid little attention. The nephew, when contacted through Ruth Beaulieu's considerable network, was willing to discuss a shared access agreement in exchange for fence repair on his east boundary, which had been falling down for a year. When Margaret explained the arrangement to Ethan at the kitchen table, laying out the letters and the terms in the hand-drawn map Clara had made, he stared at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, Clara found this. Clara showed me where to look, Margaret said. You raised a very observant child. He stood up from the table and crossed the room and put his hands on either side of her face, carefully, like she might startle, and looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to become something else. Then he said, I don't know what to do with you. That seems to be the general consensus, Margaret said. He kissed her. It was not a practiced or polished thing. It was the kind of kiss that happens when someone has been thinking about it for longer than they intended and has run out of reasons not to. When they separated, his forehead was against hers, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Owen appeared at the kitchen doorway in his pajamas and socks and said he'd heard a noise and wanted to know if there was food available, and the moment dissolved into something more ordinary and considerably warmer. The bank accepted the revised arrangement in February. Price's interest in the debt became irrelevant. He did not give up immediately. Men like Price rarely did. But when he showed up at the property line in March with a proprietary air and began a sentence about good sense and reasonable women, Margaret was the one who met him at the gate. She had Clara's map in one hand and a copy of the Gauthier access agreement in the other, and she explained to him, in the pleasantly matter-of-fact tone of a woman who has done her research, exactly why his strategy had stopped working. She told him the spring, the lease, the bank deferral, the numbers. She told him that if he had further business with the Rourke property, he was welcome to conduct it through their solicitor in Calgary. Price looked at her for a long time. Then he said, You're not what I expected. No, Margaret said, I rarely am. He rode away. She didn't watch him go. Spring was late that year, still cold in April, the pastures soft with snowmelt, and the creek running high and clear through the north field. Margaret stood at the kitchen window one morning, watching Ethan work a young horse in the near paddock. Clara perched on the fence railing offering commentary that he appeared to be taking seriously. Owen came in from the cold with mud on both boots and a rock he wanted her to identify, which she couldn't, but they looked it up together in one of Ruth Beaulieu's books and decided it was probably quartzite and probably very old, and Owen put it on the shelf above the stove with the other specimens that had been accumulating there since November. The shelf had been Ethan's idea. He'd put up the bracket one Sunday afternoon without comment. Owen had immediately understood it as an invitation. The house was different than it had been in October. It wasn't the curtains Margaret had put up in the front room, or the rag rug Clara had helped her braid, or the small things accumulated over winter. It was something harder to name. The house had resumed the habit of being lived in. It had stopped holding its breath. One evening in May, with the windows open, for the first time, the smell of new grass coming through the screens, Ethan sat beside her on the porch steps while the children's voices drifted from the barn, where they were theoretically helping with the evening chores and actually talking to the horses. He said, I've been trying to find the right way to say something. She waited. He said, When Dorothy died, that was my wife. I decided I was finished with hoping for things, that it was easier to manage, to just keep going forward without expecting anything from it. He paused. You made that impossible to maintain. She looked at him. I don't mean that as a complaint, he said quickly. I know. He looked at his hands. The practical thing, he said, was to find someone capable, someone who wouldn't be broken by this life. That's what I told myself I was looking for. He stopped. That's not what I found. What did you find? She asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, Someone who made me want to hope again, which is considerably more frightening than practical. Margaret looked at the fields going gold in the low light, the mountains visible on clear days like blue suggestions along the horizon. She thought about her mother's kitchen and the cameo brooch left behind, and the girl who had spent 26 years being the one people looked past. She said, "I know what it is to close yourself off to protect what's left." She said it without looking at him. It feels like safety, but it's actually just a very slow disappearing. He reached over and took her hand, without making an announcement of it, the way you pick up something you've decided belongs with you. They sat there, while the light left the sky, and the children came in from the barn, smelling of horses and hay, and Owen announced that the gray mare had made a face at him specifically, and he needed to discuss what that meant. And Clara said Owen was being dramatic, and Ethan said both of these things could be tried simultaneously. And Margaret laughed and went inside to start supper, with the feeling of someone who has stopped waiting to be seen, and has simply, finally been seen. Summer came hard and green. The lease arrangement with Henderson held through the season. The Gauthier spring ran steady. 3 new calves arrived in June, which Owen named despite being told not to, and the names stuck anyway because Owen was persistent, and the calves seemed to respond to them. Margaret went to the church social in July, and was assessed and whispered about, and gradually, grudgingly, left alone when it became clear she was neither intimidated by the assessment nor interested in the whispers. Ruth Beaulieu stood beside her the whole evening, and made dry observations that helped considerably. Mrs. Hartfield sought her out near the end of the night with an expression that had rearranged itself from speculative to something approaching respect. She said that she'd heard about the price matter, and that the community was glad to see the Rourke land stay in Rourke hands. Margaret thanked her for saying so. Mrs. Hartfield said, "You're not what we expected." "People keep telling me that," Margaret said pleasantly. In August, a letter arrived from her sister Frances in Lethbridge. It was 3 pages long and contained, buried in the middle of the second page, the information that their mother had been asking after her and had said. And Frances quoted this carefully, aware of its weight, that she supposed Margaret had turned out all right after all. Margaret read this to Ethan that evening. He considered it for a moment. Then he said, "That might be the most backhanded compliment I've ever heard. It's from my mother. They come backhand." He said, "For what it's worth, all right is a significant understatement." She folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer, where she kept things that mattered, but didn't need to be looked at often. Then she went back to what she'd been doing, which was teaching Clara to make pastry, and Clara was better at it than she was, which Margaret said out loud because it was true, and Clara deserved to hear it. Clara looked up with flour on her nose and said, "You're not like I thought you'd be." "What did you think I'd be?" Clara considered this seriously. Someone trying to replace her. She said it without accusation. "That's what I was afraid of." Margaret set down her rolling pin. She said, "I'm not trying to replace anyone. Your mother is yours. I'm just someone who arrived and stayed, and I'd like to be useful to you if you'll let me." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're already useful. You found the spring." That was your map. You knew what to do with it." A pause. Then Clara went back to the pastry with the focused competence of a girl who had been managing more than her share for a long time, and was perhaps, cautiously, willing to share the weight. Autumn returned, the second one. The ranch was stable in a way it hadn't been in years, not flourishing yet, but pointed in that direction. The house had a second shelf now for books this time, built by Ethan on a Sunday in September, while Owen supervised, and Margaret read aloud from something Ruth had lent her. One evening in October, the anniversary of her arrival give or take a week, Margaret stood on the porch in the early dark. The temperature had dropped. The stars were very bright, the way they got out here when the air went cold and clear. She could see her breath. Ethan came out and stood beside her. He said, "A year." She said, "A year." They stood in silence for a while, looking at the dark fields and the bright sky. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said last winter, about dying invisible." She waited. He said, "I want you to know, and I should have said this clearly before, so I'm saying it now, you are the least invisible person I have ever encountered." He said it the way he said most important things, plainly, without decoration, which was the only way she'd have believed it. You walk into a room and it rearranges itself. You look at a problem and it gets smaller. You looked at this land and this family and this disaster of a financial situation and you just decided to handle it. He stopped. "I'm grateful every day that Frances put that advertisement in the paper, even if it was presumptuous of her. It was extremely presumptuous of her. It also changed everything." Margaret looked at the stars. She thought about the woman who had stood in her mother's kitchen, reading a telegram with shaking hands, feeling like an escape route rather than a choice. She thought about the train north and the cold platform and the man who'd loaded her trunk without fuss and taken her home without ceremony, which had turned out to be exactly the kind of welcome she'd needed. She said, "I came here running away. I thought that's all it was. And now? Now I know I came because I was ready to become someone I hadn't been allowed to be yet." She paused. "You and Clara and Owen and this impossible frozen province just gave me the room to do it." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. He said, "For the record, I didn't choose you because you were practical." He paused. "Well, I chose you because you were practical, but I kept you because you're extraordinary." She laughed. "Nobody has ever called me extraordinary." "I'm calling you extraordinary." "It's a bold claim." "I'm a confident man." She laughed again, and he did too. And inside the house, a light was on in the kitchen where Clara had gone to do her homework, and Owen had almost certainly gone to eat something he'd been told to leave until morning. And the cold came down from the north the way it always did, honest and without apology. And Margaret Calloway, Margaret Rourke, stood inside it and felt, for the first time in her life, exactly the right size. There's a moment near the end of Margaret's story that I keep coming back to. She's standing on a porch in the Alberta dark, breath visible in the cold air, and Ethan tells her she's the least invisible person he's ever encountered. And she doesn't deflect it. She doesn't apologize for it. She just stands there and lets it be true. That moment didn't happen by accident. It happened because of every choice she made before it. When I think about what actually drove Margaret's story forward, it wasn't luck and it wasn't fate. It was something more straightforward than that. She arrived in Crossfield with almost nothing. No status, no beauty, by her family's measure, no guarantee that any of it would work. And she chose, again and again, to act with integrity anyway. When Dunnett and the other hand were about to come to blows, she didn't have the authority to stop them. She had no title, no history with these men, no leverage. What she had was the quiet certainty that someone needed to say that's enough, and that she was willing to be the person who said it. That's what I'd call moral courage. Not the dramatic kind, but the ordinary daily kind that doesn't wait for permission. And then there was Clara's map. A 9-year-old girl drew a rough sketch of the property lines because she'd been paying attention, because Margaret had treated her like someone worth listening to. The Gauthier spring was there all along. Nobody found it because nobody thought to ask the child who'd been watching everything from the edges of rooms. Margaret's intelligence wasn't just about numbers and ledgers, though she was good at those. It was about knowing which questions to ask, and who might have answers that hadn't been considered yet. The solution to Price's threat came not from cleverness alone, but from the combination of paying attention and being willing to look in unexpected places. That kind of thinking, the kind that stays curious instead of defensive, that's what kept the ranch. And the perseverance, that's the part that doesn't get enough credit in stories like this. Margaret didn't transform overnight. She burned things on the stove and had to start over. She walked into a town that whispered about her and kept going back. She sat at a kitchen table night after night working through numbers with a man who was still figuring out how to let someone in. None of it was a single dramatic gesture. It was the accumulation of days where she decided, again, to stay and try. What I believe, and what Margaret's story keeps reminding me, is that these three things build on each other in a way that can't be faked. You can be smart without being honest, but your intelligence will eventually serve the wrong ends. You can be persistent without integrity, and you'll just wear people down. It's when all three move together, when you do the right thing, think it through carefully, and refuse to quit, that something real gets built. Margaret didn't become extraordinary by becoming someone different. She became extraordinary by finally being somewhere that let her be fully herself. The land didn't care that she wasn't pretty by her mother's standards. It only asked whether she'd show up and do the work. She showed up every single day. I think about that whenever I'm tempted to wait until conditions are better, or until I'm more qualified, or until someone tells me I'm ready. Margaret wasn't ready. She was just willing. And willing, it turns out, was enough to change everything.